Okay, welcome everybody. I see the participant count increasing, so many of you are logging in. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Salem Center for Policy Events, Academics and Government here at the University of Texas, McCombs School of Business. We have assembled today three excellent panels, I hope to be excellent panels, on the role of PhD trained financial economists and accountants at regulatory institutions, which includes not only federal agencies, but also self-regulatory organizations and standard bodies or standard setters. Our first panel today, we're going to hear from the Federal Reserve System, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Office of Financial Research. The second panel, we're going to hear from market regulators and standard setters, the SEC, FASB, PCAOB, and FINRA. And our final panel today, we're going to hear from senior scholars from academia. They're going to discuss their experience in organizations like those that are represented today on how to think about spending time in government from an academic perspective. These panels are designed for those of you thinking about spending time in government. It could be that you're a job market candidate on the rookie market looking for a permanent placement, perhaps an assistant professor looking to stop your clock or gain institutional knowledge by spending time at a regulator. It's also relevant for tenured faculty thinking about where to spend time on sabbatical, or those of you who are simply interested in exploring research collaborations with staff at these agencies. Each institution represented today has a different set of programs and practices related to each of these types of positions. The event is designed to help you understand what they are, and particularly for those of you who are actively seeking a potential position at one of these agencies. A couple of business items before we get started. We want to hear your questions. So if you have one for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A function of the webinar. We also have the chat function open. If you want to say hello world or offer commentary to the peers that are participating, feel free to do that, but we will not be actively monitoring that for questions for our panelists. And those are the only two business items that I have today. And not to waste any more time with introductions, let me introduce Dick Berner from the NYU Stern School of Business, who will moderate the first panel. His vita is far too long to do it justice in the short time that we have here, but let me just say that he was most recently, before joining NYU, the inaugural director for the Office of Financial Research. Before that, he spent time as the chief economist at major Wall Street banks. He spent time at the Federal Reserve Bank system, and he's basically taken had every role that might be relevant for somebody here listening today to understand how academics overlaps with government. So Dick, it's all you. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Well, I appreciate that kind introduction. And it is the case that since I've spent some time both in government, business, and now academia, that gives me a perspective to really interrogate our panelists, and it's all about them, not me, today. So, you know, we're here to talk about the costs and benefits, and with an emphasis on the benefits of public service for people who are in academia and who are considering broadening their skills, broadening their perspective, and enhancing their career. And I tend to look at those three things as ways to really help you in your career, regardless of whether or not you want to migrate from academia to public service or not, and whether you want to go back. And there are many opportunities. And so to help us talk about that today, we do have in our first panel representatives from both Fed and Treasury. John Guyton, who's chief of the Partnership and Innovation Lab at the IRS. Joao Santos, who's a senior vice president at the New York Fed. Stacey Schreft, who's deputy director for research at the OFR, now on leave to the Federal Reserve Board, and Skander van der Heuvel at the board, where he's been for a lot of his career. This fantastic panel is going to explore these issues, and maybe from that cost-benefit framework, we could go around to each of you, perhaps in alphabetical order, starting with John, and talk about how you look at what you're doing in your career and how you would think about welcoming people who are in academia today and talk about the benefits to them of participating in the work that you do. So John, why don't you start?
Sure, will do. There are several opportunities for academics to work with us. There's you can go to work for us as an employee, but there are a variety of other programs. We have various partnership programs, particularly through the Intergovernmental Personnel Act. I think this would apply not just to IRS and Treasury, but broader. There are programs under which academics can work, can essentially come in as employees, as employees of the IRS in this case, while maintaining their academic position and wear both hats. So they work with us, they're paid by their institution, they have whatever responsibilities and roles they have there, but they also work with us and have staff-like access to data, have access to our people and expertise here, and can work with us in a research capacity on projects of joint interest. Earlier in the career, there were student volunteer kind of arrangements, which can work very well for PhDs who are in the dissertation stage. Afterwards, like I said, there's the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, which can work at a variety of stages in your career. And then there are fellow programs that can work for folks that are mid-career or senior career to come and do a couple of years work with us, under those programs. We have ways to do it directly. There's also through the Office of Evaluation Sciences at the Government Services Administration. So there are a number of paths to do this. In terms of the benefits, working with IRS or Treasury, you have access to essentially an economic census of the US every year through the tax data, and a wide variety of both natural variation and programmatic, sometimes randomized controlled trials, where in addition to questions of tax administration, often there are basic questions of economics, behavioral science, accounting that have even computer science or law that have broader application than our domain area. And so that's a nice area to do some work and have some real impact with the work along the way.
Great. And those data that you mentioned, the tax data, are highly granular and represent a trove of information for anyone doing research in tax policy and tax analysis and thinking about issues like inequality and so on. People could get access to those data whether or not they come to IRS, but the additional benefit, it seems to me, of going to the IRS would be that you get to work with people who really have deep understanding of those data and can really work collaboratively to explore them and do research in them. Does that sound right?
That's correct. There's the domain, the program expertise, but there's also the analysts here who have a blend of program expertise, but also experience working with advanced analytics and with the broader community that are a very helpful bridge on some of this work.
Great. Okay, let's switch to Joao. Joao, tell us about opportunities at the New York Fed. It's not part of the federal government, as we all know, but the Federal Reserve is our central bank, and the New York Fed plays a key role in thinking about financial stability and the functioning of our financial system. And you've done some work in that area or those areas. Tell us about the opportunities.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, my colleagues here in the panel, and all those who are listening to us, and congrats to those who are finishing their PhDs and are on the market, and good luck for them. So put this way, there is the opportunities, you can put them in two groups. Of course, there's the employment, and we are looking, we are in the job market, we'll be hiring this year. So if you are interested, there is an announcement and it goes through the normal process in the academic world. In addition to that, we have a large, as the previous speaker also in New York, we have a large set of visitor opportunities for PhDs, for academics, shorter term, longer term, up to 1 year. directed at different groups. For example, the 1 year is more senior, and what we call the presidential visitor. So, but there is a large set, including days or weeks. So that's there are a variety of opportunities. In terms of the pluses or the benefits, well, we are very, yes, we are a policy institution, but research counts a lot. And just to give you an idea, an economist that joins New York, usually the first year, you get pretty much the entire time to do your research. That's the trajectory. You don't have any policy work. And increasingly over time, you get more policy work. But the policy work tends to be, and we make a huge effort to connect that policy work to your research. And so that we usually joke that you are supposed to do 75% of each, meaning policy and research. Because there is that big effort, and those who succeed are those who are able to link those two things. And then in steady state, you go to a point where you do half of each, more realistically. Early on, what advances you in the career are the publications. And we do emphasize and we put lots of weight in publications in high quality journals. And that's what's going to drive you in the first part of your career. Now, in terms of the advantages when you are in that environment, well, not surprisingly, there are lots of data that many of them come from vendors, others that are unique to the Fed due to its supervisory and other roles. There is lots of support. We have a very good army of research assistants that's very helpful for the policy and research. Another advantage that I would note is you are confronted with lots of interesting specific policy issues, but others that are just related to the debates that are ongoing both in the US and outside. And those are great opportunities to contribute, but not only to contribute, but also they usually come much earlier than they appear in the academic circles or outside in the world, because we are at the forefront and we learn those much earlier, which is a good thing if you want to really do research. In addition to that, one other advantage is we have about 65 economists. I often joke that it's like having an econ and a business school on one floor, because we cover pretty much all the areas. We don't cover all of them, but the main ones beyond the economics or on the business are the typicals that you have in a business school and in the econ department are there. In addition to that, yes, there are lots of seminars, budgets for going to conferences and things of that nature that you can pretty much see it as the same structure that you find in academia. And I'll conclude here to give them the main difference that we often pose is that, look, if you come to New York, you will have a combination of policy and research. If you go to an academic place, you have a combination of research and teaching. That's the way you should view it. And that's the way we operate. And I'll stop here.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Wow. Let's move to Stacey. Stacey, you are in a relatively new organization, the Office of Financial Research, now taking a leave to go to the Federal Reserve. So you have an opportunity to look both at both organizations. Tell us what you think the opportunities are in the OFR and how it works, and tell us about the things you're doing at the board and how that might create opportunities for our attendees.
Great, thank you, Dick, and thanks to the panelists that have gone first, because they did a lot in answering and describing, the opportunities for academics. I mean, John talked a lot about, IPA programs and different Intergovernmental Personnel Act positions. But as background, the OFR was created in 2010 through the Dodd-Frank Act to be a research arm for the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is this collection of the financial regulators. So we are pretty new, and Dick was our first director there. And so we have a focus on financial stability. I think that's the one thing that really distinguishes us from the other panelists here, that our mandate is very focused on that. So when we look for visitors, when we look to hire people, our question is, are you interested in financial stability and contributing to thinking in that area? Now, that's a pretty broad area because it includes all financial markets and institutions and the interconnectedness across them. And as Joao said, I talk to people about what the mix of research and what I'll call policy-related work is, and or financial stability, practical financial stability work is. And I say that, like, long term, it's probably about 50-50. In the ideal world, I think that if you're intellectually curious and want to answer questions about, understand the world and what's going on in it, and you're smart and you come to a place like this and it's a wealth of ideas because there's all these real world problems, like we have a financial crisis we've been going through this year. Things come up and you are driven to wonder about those. We try to assign, the more practical work, policy work, based on expertise, but sometimes there's not necessarily expertise. I mean, who had really done a lot of work on financial stability implications of a pandemic before? So, if you're going to take the view that, or Brexit, we had to write about all of those things. And if you take the view that, there's no data on that, I don't know anything about that, this might not be the place for you. If you want to delve into that and be somebody who contributes to how people think about that, it's the perfect place for you. In the long run, you bring your expertise from your academic or industry or whatever background, you bring your expertise and you build expertise, and that expertise ends up giving you lots of ideas for research projects that, then build your research and publication record. So in the end, the interplay between those two kind of, mean that when you look back over a typical year, there'll be years where you have more time, years where you have less time for longer term research. But in the end, you wouldn't really be doing one without the other because there's so much feedback between the two. So, I spent 20 years in the Federal Reserve System at different reserve banks, Richmond and Kansas City, before going to the private sector and then going to the OFR. But I know Skander is on the panel, so I'm going to let him speak more specifically about the Board of Governors and the experience there.
Great. Okay, so that's a great segue to you, Skander. Tell us about opportunities at the board, and let's have a sales pitch for the academics.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for joining. Some of what I'm going to say is going to be similar to points Joao touched upon, since we are, in a bigger sense, part of the same organization, but the board is also a little bit different from the New York Fed. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that we have 4 research divisions where we hire PhD economists, whether they are fresh PhD economists or seasoned candidates that have been in academia or other institutions. I myself used to be an assistant professor at Penn before coming to the board, so I can talk a little bit about how that's what's common, what's different. So we have 4 big research divisions, and in addition, we have groups in other divisions of the board where that hire PhD economists. That means that there's a whole broad array of topics that people work on and can work on. So, obviously we're a central bank, so most people know we work on monetary policy, but it goes much broader than that. We work on financial stability, we work on payment systems, we work on consumer protection, and a whole other things. And because we just from the monetary and financial stability perspective, that means you need to think about many areas of the economy. So we hire people in many fields. macro and finance are obviously highly represented, but we also hire people in micro and labor, people working on inequality, environmental economics, and so forth. So don't think of us as just a pure macro or finance place. So that's one point I wanted to make. We're also a big place. So if you think of us as a department, it's a department with more than 400 economists. So there's lots of synergies there, lots of people to talk to. If you want an expert on topics X or Y, chances are there's somebody who's really an excellent expert on that in the organization. And it's a very collegial place. So people help each other. So Joao already mentioned, you don't teach, you do policy work. The research is more or less the same. When we hire people, we expect them to do research. They get evaluated for research. It's part of their, job description. Initially, when you arrive, most of your time is typically devoted to research. That transitions to a more equal distribution between research and policy work. What I personally really like about policy work is it's really intellectual. It can be really intellectually engaging. And like you have to be really thinking very hard about some really tough challenges, just like research. And it's also a chance to use what you know to really influence real world decisions. And if you're like me, I think that's a pretty cool thing to have the chance to do from time to time. And obviously that teaching is great as well, but that part is the part that's most different. What else did I want to touch upon? We have great resources to do both policy work and research. Many of them have been touched upon. Data, great, fantastic research assistants. We have many seminar series, both external, where we get speakers from academia and other institutions, as well as internal. We have, budgets for travel to conferences. We have working paper series and so forth. I'm sure there's a lot more I can say on any of these things, but perhaps I can leave that for the questions and turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Skander, and I'm sure we will come back, to that. Let me, having gone around the horn here, let me pose a couple of questions that are coming from the audience, and then we can come back and talk about some of these things in greater depth. So the first one is, what kind of special skills or expertise are you looking for among academics who might seek opportunities at your organization that would be a good match? So for example, are there some specializations like forensic accounting or data analytics that are more valuable than others? Maybe we could start again with John and then go around the group.
So for work where we are, both of those skills, forensic accounting, offshoot forensic economics, and data science backgrounds, these are all useful skills. So and when I say forensic economics, they're more event studies, how to disentangle causation. What's the root cause? That's one set of skills. Other set of skills would be a combination of the data science and, say, forensic accounting, domain-informed analytic skills to kind of take apart problems. These are all really useful skills for us. And the application of those, with those can make a big difference, both in the working of the agency as well as the visibility of some of the research for the researcher. Thanks.
Great. Joao, how about at the New York Fed?
Before doing that, I wanted, or answering to that, I want to emphasize one point that I missed, and I often like to emphasize here, because this is a question that we hear repeatedly, is when it comes to research, is research directed? And meaning, does the topic or the question for doing the research is dictated to the PhDs or whatever the employers? And the answer is no, because one of the things that we recognize in New York is you cannot do high quality research once the question for research is coming from the top. We make that as one of our key points, and instead it's up to you or everyone to choose whatever topic, whatever question they wish to do the research. When it comes to the policy, yes, the policy question is coming from somewhere because the bank needs to address that. But when it comes to research, no, we don't do that. And I think this is important. And I personally, I'm a strong believer in that. And I have seen that it has a huge impact on the research doing one way or another. So in terms of the skills, we pretty much hire, of course, it varies from one year to the other, depending on our needs, but we hire across the spectrum of the econ and finance areas. Now, even outside that, increasingly we are open because the world is changing and the questions are changing and the new challenges are emerging. Things like data analysis, for example, that was referred here that we wouldn't consider 10 years ago or so. Well, increasingly we look at those. So my answer is, well, if you are interested, just apply and we will consider as we consider and all the others that do it. Now, is someone that comes with completely off field from just going to pick up physics, will we hire? No. But within that spectrum of the econ finance areas, and yes, certainly the data part, we are open and interested in considering those. Thanks.
Great. Well, Stacey, Joao, just to stick with you for a minute, Stacey talked about pandemics and the implications for financial stability, and we all are thinking about those things. Would you be interested in hiring somebody who had knowledge of infectious diseases and zoonotic diseases and epidemiology to help you think about those things? Or would you reach out to others in a team approach? That's a tough question, maybe.
Is that, is that for me or Stacey?
Well, for you and Stacey. I'm going to come back to Stacey too.
Well, again, we would have to think, it depends a little bit. Let's put it this way. One of the things that we also learn over the years is that you don't want to hire, and this is important for everyone because it also speaks a lot about the way we think this and the way we want to have the organization.
Right.
There is not a huge value to have someone who is an expert on a narrow field by himself or herself. That's very challenging for that person. If it is a field that it is a bit off, we would like to have that person having connections with the other fields because that's important for the person to be successful and to contribute. And to your point, would we hire someone that was just an expert on that particular? Probably not, because we don't have enough capacity to build a group around that. And we feel that it would be extremely difficult for that person. Would we hire someone who is an expert on that, but has also interest in some of the other fields that we are interested? Probably, and yes. Now there is lots of interest, or would we consider? The answer is probably. So that's the way I would characterize it.
Right. Great. Okay, Stacey.
Yeah, so I think I'd characterize it the same way that, you know, and we would probably, if we, would have been nice to be maybe thinking about pandemics a little in advance because of the paperwork and the time it takes to bring a visitor on, but having somebody with an infectious disease background, you know, as like a visitor, that's a great way to bring that in. You know, the person with that background most likely also is not tending to think about financial stability. And you know, if you think about somebody coming from an academic background, whether, you know, an assistant professor or a new PhD, usually you have some kind of research agenda that you're bringing. And so one of the challenges we have is even if somebody's bringing you know, a portfolio of skills and, that they can bring to the OFR. They've got this agenda that they might want to continue, and that agenda may or may not overlap with financial stability and what we do, and they would have to make that transition to that and start doing that pretty quickly in new work that they bring on. While to Joao's point, it's you're coming up with your own research ideas, but they should be stuff that speaks to what we do. And so unlike at the board where they've got many divisions, we're basically a financial stability division here. So I'll stop there.
Great. Skander, anything to add to those comments and about special skills?
No, it's similar here. That was great. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that we probably hire more fields than many people think, and if we really go out of field, then the question becomes, can they talk to their colleagues who are in the part of the board where they're ending up, so that they're gonna, like Joao said, they're gonna be successful and they're gonna be benefiting from externalities both ways.
Okay. Let me ask a couple of sort of logistical questions, I think all of which kind of focus on how people can get access to these opportunities. For all of you, which of you offer placements for, say, a one-semester sabbatical? And can you discuss the authorization process in your institution once you write a paper? In other words, can there be vetoing paper? Joao talked a little bit about direction from the top for research, but there may be controversial issues that affect the way that people do their research. Are there limitations? Are there issues with proprietary databases? Those are some of the things. And of course, people want contact information and the person and the way to get in touch with the right people in HR or in Jobs USA or jobs.gov or whatever it is to express interest in governmental positions. And then citizenship. Are those issues for for all of you? So a bunch of kind of related questions. And again, I'm going to start with John.
Okay, so let me transition from the last topic. The initial question was around specialized skills. I'd like to answer a little bit more generally because it ties to some of what you just asked. We hire a broader range than just those specialized skills. In addition to economists, accountants, we hire behavioral scientists, lawyers, social psychologists, and we even have a couple of physicists. You might like, why would the IRS hire physicists? Part of the reason is connection with some of the data science and computer science skill sets that we hire, but particularly with partnerships, measures of complexity, network structure, density. These kinds of concepts are actually pretty useful in thinking about pass-through structures. In terms of the amount of time, 6 months is typically not enough. It takes, because of the nature of work, a lot of it's on kind of an annual cycle. 1 to really even 2 years is probably a better kind of time frame for working with us, given the nature of our data, the nature of our processes. And then in terms of clearance, the way we work this is we essentially negotiate clearance up front. We determine what the project's going to be. Like Joao, we encourage innovation in a wide variety of topics. We're willing to take some risk in terms of the topic, but we clear it up front. We let everybody know, here's the project, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may, and we have to let the answer be what the answer is. So what can get vetoed? There's really 2 things. It's taxpayer data, their privacy and disclosure rules under law that we have to maintain, and there's official use only sensitive but unclassified information around some aspects of particularly our enforcement processes that we have to vet for what's not revealed and for accurate characterization of those. But beyond that, the independence of the ideas and the ability to let the results speak for themselves are critical to the process, to the program.
Right. And not all relevant research, particularly with highly granular data such as those that you have, or data that are classified and have privacy issues. Some of that work might be internal, might be gratifying to do, but it might not be publishable because of its confidential nature. Is that right?
That's correct, particularly if you're doing internal work with us, similar to what others have described. There's a mix of internal, what you might call policy work, and the research work. There does have to be some connection with tax. There are 6103, the rules for access to these data. There has to be a tax administration or tax policy purpose for use of the data. So that is kind of one limitation that has to be factored in sort of upfront in terms of what projects get approved. But that's actually pretty broad if one's open-minded and thinking about it.
Right, and I just mentioned as an anecdote, when I was at the OFR, we wanted to start an advisory committee under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And so Treasury has a number of those committees, 5 of which are at the IRS. So if you're an art historian, you know, you might be involved in some of the work that IRS does in valuing art that relates to tax issues, because there's an advisory committee for that, external experts who know how to value art. So the limitations are much less than people might might
engineers
imagine.
as well. I should have mentioned engineers. We hire a number of engineers as well.
Sure. Joao, any thoughts about the logistics of those questions like citizenship and limitations and sensitive research, things like that?
Yeah, I put here 4 notes. So let me go on the citizenship part. So there is if you are interested, if you go to the New York Fed or the jobs, there is the process, and there is a questionnaire that is self-explanatory there, and that will determine those issues. Yes, in some cases there may be limitations, but rather than me spelling out exactly what they are, if you are interested and if you look at the questionnaire, you'll figure that out yourself, and it's very easy. If you have problems, drop me an email and I'll point you to the right direction. So that one, it's easy. Now, data. So there are two big parts of the data. Of course, there is the data that it's public, that we buy from, well, it's public in the sense that we buy from vendors, and there is a bunch of that, and that's not a problem. And there is the supervisory data or other source of confidential data. And really, it's interesting. I've been in New York Fed since for about 20 years or 20 plus. And maybe 10 years ago, it was very hard to access and use supervisory data for research purposes. That has changed dramatically. These days, it's very easy. There is a process, and you can use and reuse it and do it, whatever. And it's a huge advantage because it creates lots of interesting questions that you can investigate with it and so forth. But there is a process. It's very easy to do. It's very easy to access and use it. In terms of constraints, the only constraint that there is you cannot, once you use it, you cannot publish data that allows the reader to identify where the information is coming from. In other words, it's the common thing with any confidential data. You don't want the reader then be able to say, oh, this number come from bank XYZ. Other than that, you're perfectly fine. In terms of vetting of the papers, because this is an important, and it's a bit the flip side of the point that I emphasized early, which is as we emphasize that it's upon to the economists to choose their research topics, their research questions, and pursue those, we don't also vet the outcome. We know that's a risk or whatever. I don't see it as a risk, frankly. I think it's a plus because that's how you get to high quality. The only thing that we quote unquote vet is to make sure that there is no confidential information that is going to be made public. Other than that, look, it is what it is, and the research produces what it produces. And sometimes it's in favor of the Fed, sometimes it's not. We have had a fair share of complicated papers, let's put this way, or papers that have been on the other side. But I think it's a great sign. That's how you advance the debate and how you advance research, and we recognize that, and we are willing to live with that. In terms of the visitors, and you may start or you may be wondering, how does this interplay with visitors? Well, the visitors, if we have, as I mentioned, a barrage of different programs, and if they come, they can use all the data that it's public that we buy, that there is no issue there. the question that you maybe wonder, how are they allowed to use the supervisory or the confidential data? And the answer is no, they will have to do it jointly with an economist that's local, and you would work the same way as often we do with working with outside the co-authors, that they cooperate, they don't see the raw data, they see the results, but if you go and you look, there is an endless numbers of papers with joint Fed economists and academics using highly confidential data. So I'll stop here.
Great. Stacey, the OFR has access to a lot of different kinds of data, and talk about some of the maybe the benefits and the limitations there, and talk about some of the other questions that we mentioned.
Sure. I do want to say, because even in answering this question, I've noticed that my peers are using the term policy work sometime, and I saw in the Q&A a question about like what is policy work, and you might, if you go back to I think my first answer, I was kind of stumbling around a little bit with the term policy work, and sometimes I called it practical work, but I think maybe what we'll call organization mission driven work, that each of these government entities is set up with a given mission, and it has certain responsibilities that has to get done. The OFR has to monitor financial stability risks and how they're evolving and report to Congress on that every year. And so every year there is mission-driven work where you are monitoring some field and you're contributing to this annual report. So that's a good example where the Financial Stability Oversight Council has decided it wants a study of something and we're contributing to that. That's mission driven. Again, you're assigned it based on either because we have no experts because it's something that's never happened before and we think you have the right toolkit, or because we think it will help, you're a good fit for it in some way. US citizenship. So at the Treasury, we do have a requirement of US citizenship, even for visitors or sabbaticals. Jobs are posted, official job postings are always for a federal government job or through usajobs.gov, you have to apply through that. That's not necessarily the case with a visitor that's going through an Governmental Personnel Act thing. We do have ads in job openings for economists and SSRN, usually in advance of or simultaneous with the USA Jobs posting for the annual ASSA market. It's usually before, and that's a way people can express interest and make a connection there. But in the end, an application has to come through USA Jobs for somebody to be hired. Regarding visiting, like on a sabbatical, we've had people do that before. A semester or two won't work. It just would take too long to get it set up, probably. And it wouldn't be enough time to get in and really use and work with our data and to kind of connect with people there. As Joao talked about, we don't we talk with people about, the project would need to be, consistent with our mission of, that we learn something that's helpful for us and the FSOC, Financial Stability Oversight Council. We don't censor the outcome, but as he talked about, you have to anonymize the data. And as John talked about, people looking at confidential data or purchase data, you can't be giving that away. It can't be backed out. Dick, knows that we have data that we collect, but we also we're positioned to be able to get data from other government agencies, and we now have data from just about any government agency. Now, those confidential data come to us with agreements on that we will protect the confidentiality of the agreement. So if we want to use New York Fed data, I guarantee there, and we've got access to it, that you come to us and you can access with us. There is an agreement with the New York Fed that says, our lawyers talk to some of their lawyers, and there is a review that goes on to make sure that it's, where the New York Fed will want to check themselves to make sure that we haven't disclosed anything. As you can imagine, that could introduce some delays. You can't just say, hey, I just finished this draft and I'm giving a conference next week. We've had visitors do that. That won't really work for you. And if you have a short sabbatical, now the challenge is, how do you maintain access to the data? And so that's why we tend to do longer term visitor relationships. But, and then you have, you start trying to get something published, and now you have revisions. And so we've had these, you really want to be probably collaborating with somebody internally to deal with, how do you work through all those revisions when your term is now up. When we're hiring, we do have an interdisciplinary team. We have people with engineering backgrounds and computational science backgrounds but what they all bring is, applying those skills to thinking about financial markets and financial institutions. And the one other thing I'll say is the communication skills. That's really important in these environments. You've heard my peers mention that, but right from the beginning of the interview, are you able to communicate why the work that you're doing matters, how you're a fit here? If you're not communicating that, you're probably not going to communicate to a bunch of policymakers and other government regulators who don't necessarily know the details that you know. So that's something that matters and that we look at.
Great, that's really helpful, and thanks for raising the definitional issue of what we're talking about when we talk about policy work. And everybody has a different perspective on that, but that's a nice way to characterize it. And second, thanks for raising also the fact that most of these agencies employ a phalanx of lawyers to deal with a lot of these issues. And they should be your friends when you're working in these agencies, not your adversaries. There's a natural tension there, but nonetheless, they're meant to keep you, out of trouble. So the agencies also, if you have legal skills, the agencies are interested in your skills as applied to the issues that the agency is dealing with. Skander, what do you have to add to all of that?
Thanks. So a lot of it is similar to the New York Fed. So what Joao was saying, and so I have maybe a bit to add on a couple of points. One is visiting. We don't really have a standing visiting program. We have had visitors. The best avenue is to just see who's doing research in the area that you're doing research. Where do who would you like to talk to about your research? And visitors who come they cannot work on policy work. So it would be purely a research visit. We just don't allow non-employees to do any policy work. Citizenship, very quickly, we do hire foreign nationals. There are some restrictions, and so it wouldn't be a short answer if I got into those, so I won't. But in general, we hire many at the PhD level, many foreign nationals. I think I was also glad Stacey brought up what's the definition of policy work, and there's a great way of describing it. Maybe I'll add a little bit more to emphasize the breadth of kind of work that you can be asked to do for policy work. It can range from, very short term, write a memo on this topic, summarizes the state of our knowledge on a particular policy questions that's on the mind of policymakers. It can be model building, say to help with a forecast. You might be asked, if you're in my division, to help with the assessment of financial stability and maybe write part of our financial stability report. In some cases, it's almost directed research, right? The policy work is directed research, and it's sort of a long-term project where you're asked to try to provide the best answer to a difficult question. So it really ranges. It also depends a lot on which particular part of the organization you're in. Whereas your own research, that's much less, that's not really constrained.
Yeah,
Hey,
that's great.
Can I make just two quick observations?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to add two things, and one I would like to, because I think this is a very important point, this issue, what is policy work, and we have been talking about this, and I'm glad Stacey jumped in and gave a very good answer. But one other point I want, and I'll come back to this, one other point I want to make is, in terms of hiring in New York, we pretty much, not all the time, but the vast majority is through the normal academic market. So if you are interested, this is the perfect timing. Just look for it. The process is open, and you still have time to apply. I believe the deadline to apply is later next week. It's usually a little bit after the Thanksgiving. So that's perfect time. On the policy work, and Stacey and Skander went into this, but it is, yes, in sometimes it's a bit orthogonal to what you are doing, but in other times it is right on the top. And in other times even it's done in a way so that you pretty much get a publication. And I'll give one example that we did in New York a couple of years ago, which in fact I managed. We did a large project, given that the barrage of regulations that happened following the Great Recession. We decided to do a project to evaluate how those regulations performed. And it was a pretty wide question, but because we were the one giving the question, we told the people that wanted to contribute that this is their policy work. And yet the vast majority of them wrote it in a way that it was a paper, and many of them got a publication out of that. But while they were doing this, this was their policy work. So that's why I was joking also earlier that at the end of the time, in many occasions, you end up 75% of each, and you are successful in that work. Don't view it as something which is completely orthogonal. In other cases, maybe a little bit more like Skander was saying, there is a need to do some quote unquote directed research because there is interest in doing or a need to answer a particular question, and that counts as policy work. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Great. Let me just, if I could, add a couple of points to that. I think Skander and some others of you talked about your ability when you're visiting to participate in conferences. And of course, the other side of that is that many of these organizations also sponsor conferences where they invite academics to speak. And if you're on the inside, you have an opportunity to participate in helping to organize those conferences and direct the themes, the topics, who would speak, and to participate in the organization of those either Fed-sponsored or IRS-sponsored conferences, or in other cases, other agencies. So that's a way of fostering what Joao described as, getting the debate going and having people participate in that debate from a variety of different perspectives. The second thing is that that's important is that when you go to an agency, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to be confined to the four walls of that agency. Some of the questions that arise, research questions, policy questions that arise, extend beyond the perimeter of that agency and across all of the financial regulators, for example, to work together on things. So you get an opportunity, for example, when we had the flash rally in October of 2014, everybody was looking at new sources of data, which we realized we didn't have access to in a comprehensive and coordinated way. New ways of looking at what was going on in markets and thinking about both the financial and market aspects and the economics of what was happening. So people got together and formed an interagency team at the direction of the agency heads to really work on some of these things. And so there's opportunities to work with people in other agencies who are focused on some of these questions. And I think that enriches the opportunities that are out there, both from a research and a policy mission-driven, perspective. Okay, I think we've addressed a lot of the questions that are out there. We've answered some of them, but perhaps, as we have, I think, about 5 minutes left. Scott, maybe you could help us out with that, or how much time we have left before the break.
9 minutes left.
9 minutes left. Thank you. So maybe we could just go around this time in reverse order and sort of summarize how you feel about what we've discussed today, and what are additional points that you might want to make. Skander, I'll start with you. You're muted. Let's see if I can unmute you. Somebody has to unmute Skander. Skander, you're muted. There we go.
Okay, classic mistake. I apologize. What I said was brilliant, but I just forgot what I said. It was. I'll.
You want us to come back to you? We can do that.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you. It's. I'll go back to some of the stuff we started with. That is. It's really the two components: research, policy. Policy is the part that most people are the least familiar with, and that also depends more on which particular part of the organization you are. If you're applying, that you're that's looking at you, or that you're interested in and talking to for perhaps a visiting position. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, look at the websites of the organizations. There's usually a good description of what the organization does and its different parts. The Fed has all the economists have their web pages. See who's working on what. Get an idea, and then you'll learn a lot more about what sort of work people are doing, and where the synergies between your interests and a particular part of the organization are the greatest. Then again, just to emphasize, research continues. We don't do directed research. We do look for people whose interests just match well with ours, because then we are going to be more confident that they're also going to be happy to weigh in on the kind of questions that are on policymakers' minds, so that we have to work on as part of our regular work, of our policy work. So let me pause there and or stop there, unless there's questions. Maybe I didn't quite get at your question, Dick.
No, that was a good wrap up. Stacey.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I'll say two things. I think this has been a great discussion. If I'm thinking about, back when I was in academia and thinking about going to the government. So I'll say two things. There's a saying that there are papers about papers and papers about issues. Often in school or in academia, people tend to do more papers about papers. If you're somebody who's driven to do papers about issues, even if you're not, you're probably going to end up doing more papers about issues. Once you get into a government agency, you're going to be more looking at what's going on and how do I use the models and tools that I have to answer those. So, your inclination there is, going to impact how excited you are about that. And then, in hiring, while we have this interdisciplinary team, when we think about adding somebody to the team, from my earliest job at the Fed to now, one of the things I've learned is you think about that person, where do you have skill gaps, whether it's topical expertise, subject matter expertise, or toolkit. And how do you help fill your gaps while also having somebody who's going to bring lots of synergies with other people so that you maximize the value to the organization there.
Great. Before I move on to the other two, the organizers raise a question. Scott raises a question of, what about the relevance of economists are in influencing policy? If you have a passion to do that, how do you interact with senior officials at organizations? What does that relationship look like? Maybe I go back to Skander, then to Stacey, move on to Joao.
So that's a great question. And, in general, our role is to provide the best advice that we can provide. And of course, the ultimate choice is up to the policymaker. In some cases, it's really a process that a lot of people are involved with. Say the alternatives for the FOMC. It's not one single person. I mean, there's people who are very influential in that, but there's a lot of people who will weigh in on that and contributed to that. In other cases, it's really small. Let's say there's a bank merger and we have to decide whether the impact on financial stability. It's pretty much the staff person who really thinks about that, tells the board member, the conclusion of the analysis. Then, of course, it's up to the board member to make the decision. But that's a case where you would have, one or a few people would have a lot of influence. But of course, our ethic is to just provide the best advice on that. How do you get chances to do that? Be good at your work, have good communication skills, just like anything else.
Exactly. Thanks, Stacey.
Yeah, so, we make an effort, and I think most agencies do, to make sure that, leadership of the organization is seeing the work. And I mean, that's what we do. We brief people, leadership, and we brief the members of the FSOC. So, our people give briefings on their work to sometimes the working paper, the research paper, that deeper dive, and sometimes the more policy, directed memo to staff at the different FSOC members through FSOC committees. And then, you never know, the thing you might have toiled away with is, as like maybe you worked on hedge funds for years and people were saying, well, there aren't many risks there. All of a sudden there's a problem with hedge funds, and you're there not only giving the briefing, but now you're asked to speak to the heads of the agencies on this. You can't exactly plan that, but if you're doing good work on important topics, usually it rises up and you have influence.
Absolutely. Joao.
Yeah, I want to emphasize exactly those points that both Skander and Stacey mentioned. One thing I've noticed that over the years is that increasingly the policy making is rooted in good analytical supporting work. And that is coming from this research. And that's where there is a huge opportunity for people to contribute. So I think I'm glad that this was brought up and I think it's fun. It's a lot, it's work, and you have, of course, to do high quality work, but it's quite rewarding, and to see that you are playing a role and having an opportunity to influence. Whether it drives the outcome, it's different and depends ultimately on the policy makers, but at least you have an opportunity to have a contribution. One point I also want to bring up here, which we haven't talked, which also speaks a bit to this, is there is an international dimension to this policy work, and in New York we play a big role in that, which is the Basel and the FSP increasingly, where the US is involved, and there are lots of regulations that are done at the international level with input from different countries, including the US, and where we are big contributors. Interestingly enough, and this is, I'm glad that Stacey gave us the example of the hedge funds, because we have seen that happen a lot of times. Sometimes it's the policy work that it's being done for the purpose of addressing the question that we are facing. Sometimes it goes the other way around. It's certainly, there is a debate and people look and say, well, there was quite important and influential research that was done here, oftentimes in the institution, and that it's brought into that debate, and the person who did that research becomes a key player and a participant and try to influence that. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. One last aspect I would like to mention here is, at least I can speak this for the New York. I've been speaking for everything that I said here is vis-a-vis the research group in New York. There is also the supervision group where they also hire. So if you are, they don't do research that, but they also hire, in some cases, PhDs. So if that's what you are interested, look at the website, because there are opportunities there as well.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. And John, you get the last word.
Okay, I'll finish with an example that I think hits several of the themes you've asked about in one go. Some of the work that we've done, internal staff and academics, has been very influential of late in helping understand offshore noncompliance with individuals. It's informed research around the distribution of income and assets, but also tax evasion, offshore evasion. This work has been presented at the OECD in Paris, by me, by some of the academics working with us, by our senior leaders at the IRS, and by Treasury Council, have all presented portions of this work at the OECD. It's also been briefed out to Congress, and is arguably influential, and has been influential in maintaining some of the policies and regulations supporting that reporting. So that's an example of impact. It's broader than just us, and the researchers in this case were part of the briefing out, representing the agency at some of these international opportunities, not just our staff and our policymakers.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone on the panel, for a great discussion. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to turn this back over to Scott.
Yeah, thank you. It was a terrific panel. Thanks to all of you. Fantastic set of information presented. We're going to take a 15-minute break and move over to market regulators and standard setters. So we'll be turning off for a moment, and I want to thank again all these panelists for a terrific job.
Thank you.